Thanks again for joining us tonight with a few artists who are in our current exhibition, Glint of Transition, currently on view. I will introduce them in a few minutes, but I thought it would be good to start with just a quick overview of a few things today. On the Zoom call, please make sure just to keep your sound off. And if you have any comments or questions, you can just channel them into the chat. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end, so you can, at that time, either write your questions or unmute yourself when it's time to do that. As you can see, we are recording this video, and we'll be turning it into a video. And lastly, Camden, our gallery intern, is going to be sharing some photos of the pieces that we're talking about, just to help give context to everyone. So feel free to take a look at those if you like. So first off, I just wanted to talk about Praxis Fiber Workshop. For those, if there's any of us tonight who are not familiar with Praxis, we are an artist-run fiber and textile studio, and our mission is to further the field of fiber in Northeast Ohio by providing exhibitions like the one we're talking about, equipment, classes, studios, and lots of resources to artists and members of the community. So today we have with us Avery Williamson, Sarita Westrup, and Annalise Minjarez, and they are all part of the current exhibition that I mentioned, Glint of Transition, which is an exhibition featuring all three of these artists who are using drawing, painting, unconventional materials to examine the act of traveling across geographical, cultural, and personal thresholds to connect with oneself and also one's people. So with that, the exhibition is closing Sunday. So if you haven't had a chance to come check it out in person, if you're in Cleveland, we'd love to see you during our open hours, Sunday, noon to 4. So I thought it would be great just to kick things off by each artist taking a moment to kind of introduce themselves, talk just briefly about their art, and yeah, so go ahead.
Hi everybody, my name is Annalise Minjarez. I am an artist, interdisciplinary artist from El Paso, Texas, and I'm currently living and working in Dallas, Texas. And I got my BFA in fibers from the University of North Texas in Denton. And then right now I'm currently enrolled in the master's program at Southern Methodist University to get a master's in studio arts. And right now I'm trying to think a lot about physical and psychological barriers and concepts of movement and home and change. And I'm doing that through clay, sculpture, found objects, drawings, videos, but my main background is in textiles. So I'm always thinking about these concepts with intention and using fibers to support concepts of tension, like we have to create a textile.
Thank you.
Awesome. My name's Avery Williamson, and I am based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but I'm from Philadelphia. And I am a multidisciplinary artist. I really explore a lot of different materials, from drawing, painting, textiles, clay, animation. I'm really always looking for whatever is the right media for thinking through kind of the historical archive, the contemporary archive, the ways in which we kind of orient ourselves in this moment in time and tell our stories. And I think for me, especially as a woman, kind of inserting all the narratives of domestic life and being out in the world and navigating that. So that comes through in the different works that I do. And I got my undergraduate degree in kind of mixed media. Photography is really where I started, but kind of more towards drawing and painting. And it wasn't until I left school that I started to explore fiber and really feel that that is something that I'm continuing to play with and consider. And I really respond to Annalise talking about tension and thinking about the ways in which textiles can hold that. They can hold objects and materials and pieces, and that really excites me. So it was just wonderful to get to work with these other artists in this show.
Lovely. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarita Westrup. I'm originally from the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, from McAllen, the border town. And a lot of my work is about that place, being from the border. I'm currently living in Dallas, Texas, and my main focus is sculptural basketry. And I've been using some materials such as cement and black reed and wire, kind of evoking these civic textures that you see along checkpoints along the border. And then for this exhibition, really focused in on kitchen tools. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I really enjoy the contrast between these hard textures of the outside environment and then thinking about the domestic and relationship, migration and movement. And so I also received my undergrad degree at the University of North Texas, as well as my master's in fibers. And you know, baskets blow my mind and I'm into them. And I hope to just share a little bit more about it with you later today.
Great. Thank you all so much. We're so excited to have all three of you here and chatting with us. And welcome to the few people that have joined since we started. I do want to let you know that we're going to have some images being shot through the chat. Just reference images talking about the pieces that we're discussing. So feel free to check those out. So then at this part, we're just going to do a Q&A between me and the artists, and then we'll open up the Q&A for the audience later on. So I'm just going to start with some individual questions, starting with Avery. In your artist statement for the exhibition, you talk about how your painted cubes came out of being in quarantine and how looking at everyday objects around your home. Can you elaborate on that process and that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that for many of us, we were kind of in these confined spaces for the past 15 months, at sometimes more intensely than others. And I think once I started to realize that this was going to be more of a long-term thing, I was looking at every object in my house and being like, every corner of my house has to be functional. I have to be able to kind of have my laptop here or be able to work on a project here. And it got me thinking about, you know, not necessarily things being purely decorative, but things being functional and being able to hold the weight of my body or whatever kind of objects that have become so close and dear to like ourselves in the outside world, which feels like a computer and sitting and looking and all these ways in which we're like newly relating to life through a screen. And so that got me thinking about scaling up and thinking about my plants, which are very dear to me, and the ways in which that color palette is really informing and inspiring me and making me hopeful and reminding me of the cycles of the seasons, which I think like I've clung to in a way that I never have before in this year, of being like, I know that these flowers will bloom. Like, I know we'll get to the next month. I know that things will sprout up. And so I started to kind of merge those conversations in my head, kind of longing and looking at the outdoors and thinking about these objects into this body of work. And I think when we were having conversations about this show, we were thinking about boundaries and portals and kind of loss and ambiguity and all these like emotions that we were navigating that were showing up in our work in these different ways. And so these kind of like very structured cubes felt like they could capture the roots and the blooms and the entanglements of that. And it felt like we were all kind of in this swirl and realm of trying to make sense of what we had all been going through personally and like in this collective way. And so that is kind of how these cubes came to exist and scale up and increased in their volume. And I think as we were thinking about domestic space, we were also thinking about these colors of fruits and what we begin to associate with these comforts and smells and parts of the seasons. And I think that just kind of continued to be a unifying thread in some of the themes and locations and relationality to the domestic and the longing.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the things that I love about your pieces, they are very hopeful, and thinking about them in context of isolation and, you know, everything that we've been through with the pandemic, it's interesting because, like I said, they are hopeful. And it's also cool with how we have plants mixed in with the arrangement and thinking of the cubes in relation to household objects. So
Yeah.
it's a cool way for that to all come together.
Yeah, I loved when I came for install and I saw all these plants and in conversation with the fibers, because I think like I've been looking at nature and looking at these natural patterns and the way vines grow, and all that feels so familiar to those of us who love to play and explore in textiles. And you're like, oh, I didn't expect that to work well, or for that tension to actually hold and allow something to climb up this fence. And so I just kind of felt like those plants were asking to be included. And I think maybe in 2 or 3 years ago, we would have been like, oh, put the plants to the side. But I think after this year, it's like the domestic is part of these display places. Like they should live in conversation. They are familiar to us and comforting. And so it just felt like natural for them to be able to play along.
Yeah. That's really great. Thanks. And then my next question is for Annalise. Your piece, Tolerance for Ambiguity, is just like a very stunning and unique piece. And one of the things that I love about it is it uses really unique materials, tomatoes and cochineal, to create it. So I would just love if you could talk a little bit more about what inspired this piece and what your process was to create it.
Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate that feedback. And so when I started making that artwork, I knew I was like at a midpoint in my semester in school, because I was like in the first part of my graduate program, the first year. And then it was like, we're going on lockdown. It's like, okay. And they're like, we still need you to make artwork, and we're gonna still have like critiques and things like that. So I had already been doing a lot of research on natural dyes and cochineal, and relating the material back to Texas and Mexico. And I'm always thinking about the borderlands between Texas and Mexico in my work. And so there was like this very strong tie to cochineal, because it was like a dye that was shared in both places. So that was like the call to that medium. And then drawing was very easy to do without facilities. Like I was becoming very dependent on the facilities at my university, and then I was like cut off from those. So drawing became the next best thing for me at that time. And then the tomatoes is really just this great tie to the domestic, access to ingredients. Like really the only place we were going was the grocery store, so I could go get tomatoes for sure. Well, mostly for sure. And then there was a very key tie-in to my family and my history of like why I even got into textiles. Like my grandma taught me to sew. I'm always looking to like the women in my lineage to like get examples of like how to live my own life. And so there's some traditions of curanderismo in my family, which is like healing through different like putting tomato slices on the feet to like draw fever. And so that's a really good story in my family. So I was using like the tomato, the acid of the tomato, to pull the pigment out of the cochineal off of the paper. And it basically does like a bleaching of the cochineal, and the acidity reacts with the cochineal. So that was something that I wanted to think about in that artwork, was like this macro micro of like zooming out and looking at a big picture, and then zooming in and seeing my personal picture, and using like my family history to guide me through those narratives of like in and out, seeing something from the big picture and seeing it small. And then the title comes from a book called Borderlands by Gloria Anzaldúa. And she's a Mexican-American poet, Chicano scholar, feminist, and queer theory scholar from the borderlands of Texas and Mexico. And I'll read just a little passage from that that passage in her book that inspired the title. And it says, in perceiving conflicting information and points of view, she is subjected to a swamping of her psychological borders. She has discovered that she can't hold concepts or ideas in rigid boundaries. The borders and walls that are supposed to keep the undesirable ideas out are entrenched habits and patterns of behavior. These habits and patterns are the enemy within. So like all of a sudden, my access to the border was like from Dallas to El Paso was unavailable because I couldn't travel. And then being able to see like those borders and boundaries within my own brain within the home, like it became very clear. So that's all of that plus a little more is in that artwork. So hopefully that will become a series at some point.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. It's, again, like just a very fascinating piece, and to learn about how it was made is really interesting. And to me, it definitely references textile, but the domestic part of it isn't quite as upfront. And so it's cool to kind of, hear you talk about it in that context. So then continuing on the domestic thread, Sarita makes wonderful recreated domestic objects for the home and the kitchen, and mostly out of black reed and wire. And I know you kind of touched on this, but a lot of your work really surrounds those materials. So I'd love to just like learn a little bit more about using those materials and how they inform your work.
Yeah, well, I'd like to share a little bit about both the form and the materials, and thinking about the domestic in this year. I learned how to make empanadas through Zoom with my tío Sorani, and I bought my first tortilla press in North Carolina and got to use it and did like a Zoom class with my entire family, and that was really beautiful. And like the forms come from this desire to like perform my identity, which I kind of felt a little I guess withdrawn from. My parents are from Mexico City. I moved from McAllen to Dallas, and then I was living in North Carolina. And so through like thinking about how to perform my identity more openly, or just to be able to do that more frequently, I started to think about what are some tools that hold, gather, and protect and serve in my own home, and that I have a relationship with. So I chose the tortilla warmer, a molcajete, and the tortilla press. The one I did with Zoom, I actually like took it apart and used a portion of it for the sculpture. So it's actually like a very dear object to me. So that's where the forms come from. And they also are inspired by this story that my mother, she immigrated here in 1979. And there's this comal that's on our stove top, and it's basically just like a flat piece of iron, to toast the tortillas on. And my sibling told me that, and I didn't know this, that she immigrated here with that comal. And I just love that like this tool has been in our home watching us all grow up, and that it was the thing that was so important to my mother that she would bring it on during her travel here. So that there's this idea of like all these functional objects have these stories and are a part of our lives, and in this context of my work, a part of an immigration story. And so the materials, I talked a little bit about that. I'm really focusing in on using basketry techniques, twining, and looping and lashing, and using black reed, something that kind of is soft and flexible, but maybe from afar kind of mimics metal or the feeling of something metallic. And when twined openly has this like fence-like look that I'm going for. And then the cement for me is just growing up, like crossing international checkpoints by foot and by car, because our family had such a strong relationship with Mexico, and we only were like 10 minutes away. So we'd go casually for lunch, or we'd go all the way to Mexico City for like a wedding. But just like moving through that space and of a checkpoint, you know, it leaves such a strong, it has left a strong impression on me, all of those textures and those materials moving through the cement that surrounds the Rio Grande River, moving through these flex fences that don't allow you to climb them, to act, you know, all of these ways of civic engineering ways that like do not allow you to have access to something and to keep people out or to really channel movement. So those are the textures that I'm inspired by. And then together, it's kind of this weird contradiction of form and material, of like these forms that are joyful and connect me to my identity, to my Latinidad, and then these textures that remind me that like perhaps, you know, my family and others are not desired, and we're trying to, you know, to keep out. And so those kind of come together in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. It does come together in such a beautiful way, and just the line work and the textures and everything is amazing. And it's something that you really need to see up close. So for those people who have not seen the show in person and are in Cleveland, I hope you go see it. But that kind of, to me, brings me to Avery's work, because Avery uses a lot of like really amazing line work in her work as well, in the paintings. But you're, like you said, you're also a multidisciplinary artist. So I'm curious how you decided to submit paintings for this exhibition, and how you kind of decide like what to use certain materials for certain concepts in your work. And yeah.
Yeah, I think for this particular show, I was very like inspired by the conversations that we were having as artists leading up to it, around the themes and kind of some of the readings or what we were all kind of absorbing in that moment, and home, and this kind of idea of transition and change and kind of bits of hope, and like just things like flipping and kind of wondering when that switch would happen, when that day would happen, when things would not necessarily reopen, but begin to adjust in different ways that maybe allowed us to feel more free and to have more opportunity, because I think there's just a sense of confinement. And I think for me, I just kind of have these like ups and downs and flows of whatever type of material I'm feeling most drawn to. And so I kind of respond to whatever is the message that I'm feeling like I need to get out, that I need to say, and what is the surface or the materials that want to receive that message and kind of show up in the world. And I would say when I'm usually working with textiles and weaving, like sometimes I kind of like disappear into that work, or I feel like I can kind of like, when as Maureen was working and doing some work on this call, like it gives me space for my brain to do some other type of processing. But as we were getting ready for this show, I was feeling as though like painting was pulling me in. Like that was where I was able to kind of like allow my hands to like create this rhythm and this visual language, and it was giving me the space to process these kind of other ideas and emotions and experiences. So I think that like the material is a lot about like, where is the ritual for me? Like what is the place that I need to kind of make some space, and that is what the material kind of is like. Here, I present myself to you. And I felt that because the other work in the show kind of did such beautiful like line work and materials and movement and familiarity and kind of also strangeness and delight, that there could be something that was grounded and sculptural and structured that could really allow for those other stories to come through. And so I was excited to kind of allow all this work to be in conversation and to release myself from the expectation that kind of I had to operate in isolation. And I liked the idea of getting to really be in community and let these pieces talk to each other. And so I got to actually see everything in person at Install And it was just exciting to see kind of the shadows that all the work created, the way the light hit the different materials. And that all just really excited me about the way the line can be both painted and woven and in a basket and in conversation with concrete. So I just really loved getting to be a part of this.
Yeah, I can definitely see like the textile influence in your painting. So it's just really interesting to hear you talk about it. And it's just a great, like you said, mix of different styles and types of art in this exhibition. Um, so then my next question is for Annalise. And you talk about in your artist statement how childhood memories and the landscape you grew up in have informed a lot of the content in your work.
Mhm.
And, you know, I really see this coming through in your Concentrate, Try Again series pieces that you have in the exhibition. I'm curious, can you share like any specific memories and how they've come to play in those pieces specifically?
Yeah, I feel like there was like this anticipation or this like forever now feeling we had in in our meetings and our studio visits before the show, and so I was really thinking a lot about like the difference between like memory and nostalgia and like what's a real memory or like what is a little bit fabricated in your brain, you know. And I was able to go home and do a site visit to examine some like of those concepts of memory in El Paso before the pandemic lockdown happened. So I visited this really specific location. It's like on a state highway, and it wasn't there when I was younger. It was being built when we were growing up, me and my siblings, and it was like being built over the Rio Grande River. And then we would go and walk around there. And it's very like, there's not a lot over there. It's just like very bare, just the river. And we would just go over there, and there's like a lot of drought because it's in the desert and it's trying to like feed all this agriculture in Colorado, New Mexico, and then it finally gets to Texas. And so often the river was very empty. So we would like be in the riverbed, like playing, digging, drawing, like chasing, like just goofing around. And like that was really important memory to me because it was like, I was like, why do I make art? Like this year, all those big questions came up, like, why do I make art? And it was like, I don't know, it just makes me feel free. And I like that. I mean, it's cheesy, but I really love it. And it's like thinking about those core memories was like, those are like my most like unoccupied times. But then you go to the work and it's like inside each little kaleidoscope, there's like pieces like rocks and sand from the Rio Grande, sand from Dallas, sand from different locations. And like once you move past those like those childhood moments, you're sort of like faced with the reality of like the situation, because 11 miles from the Rio Grande near my childhood home, like the physical home, was like the beginning of the border between the United States and Mexico. And all of a sudden it's this like huge federal boundary. And it's very violent, you know, it's over militarized, and it's very like whoosh, like that little moment of like serenity is like very disrupted by like the reality of that so many people face on the border. So like the rocks were kind of like a way for me to like both capture like this like kind of like beautiful like serenity, but also put inside of them like these ideas of like construction, movement, land, and barrier. So that's kind of what I was like, these concentrate, try again, like this phrase is like, you know, you can be this and be that, but just like keep trying to like work through it and figure it out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right. And then your piece, Sarita, your piece Passage stands out from some of your other pieces because like the pieces we were talking about earlier, which are very kind of domestic kitchen type things. This one is a door, and it's just a amazing, stunning, beautiful piece that like totally draws you in. Can you talk a little bit about that piece specifically?
So I've been desiring to make a door, and the way that I see all of the pieces in conjunction with each other is that you can walk through the door and then into room of tools or in like my brain. That's how I see it. And for me, the door is a strong symbol of passage and movement and threshold, and I really enjoy that it's such a strong symbol for that, and that I think a lot of people can connect to that idea when they see something that's flat and has a handle on it, and that that handle also for me relates to the idea of a portal, and I just like to think about moving through portals and those as well as a symbol of movement and migration from one spot to another. So that's what the door for me symbolizes. And it's all made from reed and looped wire. Um, and so it has this flexibility to it. It can roll up, and thinking about being able to take it somewhere, I think is an interesting fantasy for me. Apart from that, Avery was talking about just this idea of being in conversation with other artists, and that she was in conversation with us. And this particular piece was almost in conversation with my friend Sarah Rose Lejeune. She made 19 fast paper doors, and and we shared a studio together. And so I definitely see now how her door idea kind of like came into my brain, and I want to show her what a door that I would make look like. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Then I guess I thought a good question to wrap up for you guys would be, since travel is such a big overarching theme with all of your guys' work, it'd be cool just for each of you to take a moment to kind of just talk about like kind of that theme and what it means to you. Whoever wants to start.
I can jump in. I think about travel and portals as like thinking of, I always use this kind of phrase of like pinching time, of being able to kind of like jump through time and to like be able to have a conversation or to think about your ancestors or to think about the future that you're building or shaping or kind of like responsibility to the environment and these materials and how they will exist, if they will exist in the future. And so for me, I think about that a lot in my work, especially in kind of like different titles or little narratives that I'm interested in shaping. And I think at least for me, like when I'm in the studio and working and making, I'm kind of always like having a conversation, sometimes out loud, but like trying not to talk to myself too much. But I mean, I'm very much like making work with the company of ancestors. And I think that is really a soothing part of the work. And so for me, travel is not as much tied to specific locations, but just thinking about time and the comfort of that. And again, like the rituals and movements and up and down and back and forth, and feeling that kind of once you are doing that work, you can kind of calm your brain and be able to think about these kind of parts of our DNA that have informed and taught us these different rituals. So that's how I think a lot about travel and time in my work.
That's great.
I think like in terms of travel, I guess like definitely like the word movement comes to mind. I really like thinking about like even now that that things are going back into in Texas, like things are like really moving forward. Like it's not still anymore. And it was very still there for a while. And I think that that has made me think about travel less in terms of like I'm traveling to another city or I'm going somewhere to like learn something or get that experience to like for inspiration. It's like there's like inspiration within stillness and just traveling like within your home or your city or like to the porch, you know, like from inside to outside, like that is traveling and that is can be a very big influence on your brain and your state of mind and your psyche. So just kind of like now thinking more about travel in like the smaller confines versus like distance and length now.
So travel, I think in my work, it really focuses on movement and moving to and fro. And like in the sculptural basket, it's a very short distance in which I render like one location to another. Um, but I think about that a lot, just like the arch and moving back and forth, and I think that just comes from like acknowledging the privilege that I had as a child and to be able to go back and forth from my parents' country of origin and then come back here and seeing that and with other uh, Mexicans who are able to go back and forth and have a relationship with their home country. And then in relationship to like line work, I am also considering like transparency and porousness and fluidity. So in my basket works, there's opaque areas, there's building up both thin lines and thick lines, and I do like to think about like something being able to fall through it or like water or air or something else that's able to be like not captured, not caught. Um, so that's kind of where movement and travel comes into the work. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you all so much for sharing everything about your pieces. So I just wanted to open it up to other people at this point. So I'm going to go over to the chat. It looks like we have a couple comments here. So if people want to write in any questions for the artists in the chat, then I can help read them out. And it looks like there is a question about the images for the exhibition. And as Camden pointed out, you can click and download those images. So all you have to do is just click on them, they'll quickly download, and then you'll be able to click on them again and they will open up on your computer. So that's the best way to take a look at the pieces. And then Jess Pinsky, our wonderful director, writes, congratulations on a beautiful exhibition. I'm curious if any of you have made any discoveries about your work as a result of the exhibition or the relationships your pieces were making to each other in the space. If you could tell through documentation or even from this conversation. Thanks so much again for sharing this time and space with us.
I would say definitely yes. Like, I mean, even in this conversation now, like I'm just taking notes on everything that I'm hearing because it's so wonderful to hear other artists share their work, what inspires it, kind of in a shared space together, like what they're seeing and how it's showing up together. Like I really love to hear that. And we did some kind of sending some care material packages to each other as we were thinking about this show. And I have all of that in my studio and I have things pinned up. And I feel like there's just like a long arc of marination of like getting to think about working with other artists. And I hope this is the first of kind of more collaborations together, because I just feel like I learn so much every time I hear Annalise and Sarita talk about their work. And it excites me to experiment with other materials and think about all the meaning and significance that go into the colors and material in their work and how they're rooted in the land. And for me, that is something that I am thinking more and more about. And I might not have thought as much about that without the opportunity to do this show. So I feel really strongly that working with others and being in these group shows is just the beginning of relationships, of working together and chances to learn. I'm grateful for that.
I think like these elements of line that are really prevalent in like all of our works is really exciting to think about. I really wish I could see that in our pieces, like at Praxis. But I also am very curious, like Avery talked about cycles a little bit earlier. And like that's something that I think is really exciting to think about in terms of movement and travel. Like maybe the travel and the movement is within cycles, and maybe those are things that you can depend on, whether it, and that can be neutral, that can be good or bad or great or terrible. Like those are the cycles, right? And I think that's really interesting concept to think about. And I know that like our meetups for this exhibition were like pretty crucial to my year in terms of like just moving forward with my work, and like remembering that like I make artwork to like figure things out as well. In addition, it helps me solve things in my head. So I just really appreciate this opportunity to work with Sarita and Avery, and to share like virtual space with you guys and like the physical space of the exhibition.
Oh yeah, like those meetups were gold. And so many notes in my sketchbook from those talks together. One thing I did realize that I hadn't realized like until a couple weeks ago is that story that I just shared with all of y'all about my mom and her coma. And like I didn't realize that like that story had impacted the work so deeply. So that was a really nice thing to uncover at the time. And when I see the image of Annalise's painted piece with the tomato slices next to the molcajete, I'm just like, oh, those really have a nice conversation together and relate in this unique way. And then there's an image of Avery's sculptures next to the doorway, and it just fills me with a lot of joy to see them together and relating to each other and having a chat. And I really wish I could see it in person. And really look forward to keep working together and getting Avery out here to Dallas to teach a weaving workshop. So.
Well, yeah, it's been such a great time just seeing how everything's come together. And for me, it was just such a fun installation to install. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Does anyone else have any other questions? Well, while we're here. I guess not. All right. Thank you again, Annalise, Avery, Sarita, and everyone who's joined us this evening. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for showing your amazing work in our gallery.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for joining.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Margie. Thank you, Daniela.